In the summer in 1999, Ann Paetz was in the prime of her life, a recent college student now living at home. She was young, high energy, and carefree. It was normal for her to leave the house late at night and then come back even later. So on July 2nd, when Ann went out to grab a pack of cigarettes well after midnight, no one in her family thought much of it. But they had no way of knowing that it would be the last time any of them saw her alive. The sun was barely starting to rise on July 2nd, 1999, when mother of four, Janet Paetz, was woken up suddenly by her phone ringing. She was confused to be getting a call so early, but that confusion gave way to concern when she realized that on the other end of the line was a police officer. He was asking her to come collect her tan 1995 Ford Contour that had been abandoned on the side of the highway in Genesee County. This was puzzling to Janet because she hadn't taken her car out the previous night, and she certainly hadn't abandoned it on the side of the highway in a county 20 minutes away from her Saginaw, Michigan home. But the car that the officer described was hers. Same model, same plate. So with a bad feeling in her stomach, Janet agreed to go pick it up. But she obviously couldn't get the car alone. She needed someone to drive it back with her. So she went to wake up one of her kids to go with her. And that's when she realized that her 23-year-old daughter, Ann, wasn't in her room. Actually, Ann wasn't home at all. Ann's brother Jason recalled how his mother came into his bedroom telling him he had to come with her. Something was wrong. When he asked what she meant, she explained that Ann never came home last night. Jason said he could tell his mother was nervous that morning, and he knew the situation was a bit strange. But honestly, he didn't think that much of it. Ann was an adult. She was often out doing her own thing, and she didn't always tell her family exactly where she was. Jason also knew that even though Ann's car was at home, she was having trouble with it the day before. So he figured that she probably borrowed their mother's car to run to the store, or maybe visit her boyfriend who lived a few towns over. In fact, it sounded like the car was actually parked just outside of the trailer park where Ann's boyfriend lived on Vienna Road. Jason explained that borrowing their mother's car was normal, but she had to get to work in the morning. So, for the car to still not be there in the morning was absolutely unacceptable. How was their mother going to get to work? Jason and Janet met police on the side of the highway at around 6 a.m. Police explained to them that they'd found the empty car parked in an acceleration lane. It was off, but the doors were unlocked, and the key was still in the ignition. So police actually had gotten into the car, started it up, and moved it off the road so it wouldn't cause a hazard. Officers also said that the driver's side window was rolled halfway down, and there was a small dent in the back quarter panel, which Janet said wasn't there the day before. None of this information was doing anything to reassure Janet. She still had thoughts about Ann racing in the back of her mind, but for one reason or another, she didn't think to bring it up with the officers just yet. She was probably trying to reassure herself that she was just overthinking this. Her errand had to be just fine. Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Bill Arndt noted that nobody thought at that time when the car was found anything was wrong. This part is a little fuzzy for the family to try and recount, but the detectives were able to fill in some of the blanks based on old reports. So according to what they have, it seems like Janet and Jason took the car and headed home, but not before stopping at a mechanic to check out what they thought might have been a bad tire. Apparently, like Ann's car, Janet's car had been having issues too, so they probably figured why not just take care of it while it was fresh on the mind. The issue they thought they had with the tire actually ended up being mechanical, so they left the car at the shop and then made it home at around 7:45 in the morning. Janet likely got ready and headed to work, hoping that Ann would show up later and explain the whole car debacle. And about that same time, a woman named Karen was heading out for her morning jog on none other than Vienna Road. Everything was going as usual for her until Karen passed by what she thought, or perhaps hoped, was a mannequin lying face down in the grass. But it's never a mannequin. Karen wasn't really up for investigating the situation further on her own, but she did find it odd enough to relay the information to her husband when she got home. Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Dave Rabard explained that the husband then drove up to the scene, observed it, realized that it was a person, and went to a local residence to have them call 911 to report the body. About half an hour after the 911 call, police arrived at the scene. And keep in mind, it's only about 10 miles from where Janet's abandoned car was found earlier that morning. It's not like a rural country road. This is something that receives a lot of traffic 24 hours a day, just a couple of feet off the road. So during the daylight hours, probably everyone would see it. It wasn't like somebody tried to hide the body. They didn't drag it off the road. They didn't drag it off the road. Somebody very quickly stopped, pushed the body off the road, and it wasn't a ditch. It was simply just off the road. The sight so many people had probably passed by that morning without even knowing was gruesome. They reported that the woman's clothes, and she was fully clothed, were soaked in blood, and it all seemed to be coming from her face and her neck. Her shirt was pulled up ever so slightly, but police said it looked like it could have come from being dragged onto the grass. Police also found what looked like ligature marks around the woman's wrists. What they didn't find, though, was anything that could help them identify her. She didn't have her driver's license or anything with her. So first responders had a young female with unknown identity, which they now had to research. So it was reported as a Jane Doe. At the same time, the parents were calling in a missing person saying they got their car back, but were missing their daughter. After Janet had made that call, it didn't take long for police to put two and two together. Anne's Aunt Sandra was a detective in Saginaw at the time, and she went and identified her for the parents. Jason remembered it was a beautiful day. It was about the perfect summer day. That's one thing he remembered, sitting out on the back deck thinking, how can this be such a beautiful day? And this is the worst day of his life. Police had to do some backtracking. They needed to process the abandoned car scene for evidence. They also needed to process the car, which they had willingly handed over to Janet just hours earlier. With two separate sites to analyze and a 10-mile stretch of highway to cover, responding detectives realized that they needed to call for some backup. Their agency was quite large, so there were multiple detectives, multiple troops. They canvassed the 2 blocks that encompassed where her body was found. They went to all the trailers at the local trailer park and all those houses, probably 100 different residences that they attempted to contact. So they did quite a bit of work in those initial hours of trying to come up with anything. Right off the bat, they received tons of tips. It turned out several people in the area saw Janet's car parked on the highway that morning. One woman reported that she also saw a separate vehicle, one she described as a blue pickup truck with cab lights parked behind it. She even thought she might have seen 2 people standing between the vehicles. But she said she didn't pay much attention, probably not thinking anything was seriously wrong at the time. Another person who lived in the area near where Anne's body was found told detectives that she was woken up by her dogs barking at something like 7:30 in the morning. And when she went to go see what it was, she saw a vehicle driving very slowly down the road. She also described that vehicle as a pickup truck with cab lights, but in her recollection it was red and white, not blue. As for Janet's car, it was kind of a bust. When investigators combed through it, they found Anne's wallet and a fresh pack of cigarettes inside, but no ID. In fact, to this day, Anne's ID has never been recovered, and the only unidentified print that they found on the car turned out to belong to the mechanic, the one that Janet confirmed she had taken the car to directly from the scene that morning. The only potential clue that they gathered on the car was from some fresh grass and mud around the tires, which didn't really add up because the area on the highway that they found it on was completely paved. Actually, the whole way from Saginaw to Genesee County is all paved highway. Detectives also said that there were some partial tire impressions in the road where Anne's body was found, which they looked into. But because it was such a public road, there wasn't much they could do to definitively connect them to this case. So the next logical step in their investigation became clear. Due to where her body was in the vehicle, it left a lot of unanswered questions right away. So now, the investigation began with trying to figure out where Anne was going, the time frame, why, and what happened to her. According to her siblings, Anne's last day alive was fairly typical. She went to work at a local car dealership where she was a saleswoman, and everyone close to Anne said she was outgoing, beautiful, and very easy to like, which sounds like a winning formula for a sales job. After work, Anne called her boyfriend, who can be called John. She wanted to tell him she was having car trouble, but she'd maybe see him later. Then around 9 p.m., she went out to a bar with a friend, who can be called Max. Newspapers at the time reported that this meetup was a date, but from reporting it's known that the pair seemed to be just friends. That night they drank, they shot some pool, danced, and at 1 a.m., Max dropped Anne back home. That timeline was verified by Anne's brother Adam, who was up when she got back. The pair spoke for a bit before Anne went to her room, where she made 2 phone calls to her boyfriend John, one at 1:27 in the morning and another at 1:33. He didn't pick up either call. He was apparently busy playing video games and watching movies with a friend. But a few minutes after that second call, Anne came out of her room and told Adam that she was going to go get some smokes. And those were the last words he'd ever hear her say before Anne drove off in her mother's car. Investigators did find a fresh pack of cigarettes in Janet's car when they processed it, so they knew Anne must have picked some up that night. But didn't know exactly where, so they started canvassing practically every place in between, and they got lucky in 2 spots. They also found some video at Conley's, which is a convenience store on the highway, and eventually determined that there was also a look-alike there that could be Anne. Those sightings of Anne on video at the 2 convenience stores were murky, and statements from employees at the stores couldn't confirm that either sighting was definitely Anne. So police were basically forced to move on. And because of the calls that Anne made to John and the location of the abandoned car near his trailer park, most arrows were pointing directly to him. Of course, he became suspect number 1 originally, and detectives went and spoke with him almost immediately once they learned about him. John said he was home all night with his mother, father, and a friend who could all corroborate his story. He also agreed to sit for a polygraph test, and though that ended up being inconclusive because his alibi checked out, he was ruled out fairly quickly. Same for Max, who passed a polygraph and had an alibi that checked out too. So just as quick as the investigation got started, it was feeling like maybe they were going to hit a wall. With John and Max pretty much ruled out, police didn't know who else to look at. Like mentioned, Anne was a likable person. In her brother's words, nobody hated Anne, not a single person. She would just go make friends with everybody. So investigators turned their attention to the autopsy, which came back the next day. And it actually brought a few important things to light. First, the cause of death was extremely violent. Multiple stab wounds to the head, face, and neck, which led to significant blood loss. When you get stabbed in the face, it's typically personal. If someone stabs you in the back, they didn't even know each other. But if they stab you in the face, it's typically personal. Secondly, the autopsy revealed that Anne had defensive wounds on her forearms, wrists, and hands. She also had a BAC of 15 at the time of autopsy, which was almost double the legal driving limit. And for a 5'2", 110-pound petite girl like Anne, that indicated that she was likely a bit intoxicated when she was attacked, but clearly not too drunk to fight back. So if she realized that she was in a bad situation, she wasn't just going to submit to it. She'd most likely put up a fight. Depending on the ultimate motive, that fight could have warded off a potential sexual assault. Because the autopsy confirmed what detectives at the scene predicted, that Anne didn't appear to have been sexually assaulted. Everything she'd been wearing was collected and analyzed, but most of it was saturated in her blood. And most, but not all. There was one spot on a ring that Anne was wearing where her blood was not present, but someone else's was. There were only trace amounts, but it was enough to pull a profile from and enter into Cody's, which they did immediately. But unfortunately and unsurprisingly, they didn't get a hit, though that doesn't carry the same weight as it might today. CODIS was only officially implemented a year before Anne's murder, so it wasn't necessarily shocking that the blood on her ring didn't come up with a match then. On July 6th, 4 days after Anne's murder, investigators decided to really step things up. Along with putting out a Crime Stoppers alert, they assembled a task force with 15 detectives from a bunch of different agencies to look into nearby crimes that could be connected. And they hugely expanded the scope of the investigation. They then started looking at friends and friends of friends and people she met at the bar that night and her past history. Were there other people that could have become suspects in this crime? They just didn't sit on their heels, and this wasn't just something sitting on the shelf. They really did a really concerted effort of locating anybody that had any connection with Anne or any of her friends at all. They even went as far as to track down Anne's high school friends and people she'd recently sold cars to. As part of the task force, they came up with a tip line, and they have a binder with possibly 2,000 tips. Not only were they investigating any evidence or people from the crime scene, they also had tips flowing in from all the media attention that it got, and they were running every single one of these tips down. In a weird twist of fate, on the same day that the task force was assembled, another young woman from Saginaw County was forced off a highway at night and sexually assaulted. So, given the timing and the location of the incidents, Investigators linked the two cases and began to build a theory about an opportunistic predator who was targeting random women alone on highways at night. And their theory seemed legitimate when just a few weeks after that, another brutal crime was committed less than 10 miles from where Anne's body was found. It happened in a little city called Clio. This time, the victims were sisters only 9 and 13 years old. So he kidnapped them from a bike path, took them just off the bike path, brutally raped them, strangled them with their shoelaces until they were unconscious, and then he left them for dead. Then, one of the girls woke up, thank God, got the other one up, and they, of course, started another investigation. Not only did both girls survive that assault, but they were also able to give a fairly detailed description of their attacker, which went out on TV and allowed detectives to zero in on a man who the Detroit Free Press reported at the time as being Jack Hall. He was a local man that owned a floor resurfacing business and happened to live in the same apartment complex as the sisters. Arndt and Robard were not the ones to give the name Jack Hall. They would only refer to him by a pseudonym of James during their interview. However, so police wanted to track down Jack Hall ASAP, not only to see if he was responsible for the brutal attack on those young sisters, but also Anne's murder and that other similar case. But it wasn't going to be that easy. When they went to knock on the door, they said they'd like to talk to him regarding his vehicle because the vehicle had a bad plate on it or something like that. So he thought something was up. So instead of talking to the police about a bad plate, he fled, jumped out the window, ran and hid, went several miles to his parents' house, and then a manhunt ensued. When police finally caught up with Hall later that night, he was hiding out in his parents' attic. And when they approached him there, he actually ended up disarming a deputy, taking her gun and firing off some shots. Thankfully, no one was hit, but he was able to get away. And for almost 2 more days, police had no idea where this guy was. But on that second day, out of the blue, Hall just turned himself in. And what's even weirder is he had cut his hair and shaved like he was trying to change his appearance, which is usually what someone does when they're trying to avoid being caught, not in preparation to turn themselves in. The explanation is that he wanted to look good for the media because they knew they were looking for him. So he cut his hair and shaved, put on clean clothes for the appearance. When police charged Hall with the attempted murder and sexual assault of the sisters based on their testimony, they took his DNA and put it into Cody's. And lo and behold, there was a match. It wasn't a match for Anne's case, though, or the other Saginaw woman. It was actually DNA taken from a crime committed 6 years prior when Hall abducted a woman named Heidi as she was leaving work, pulled her into the woods, tied her up, sexually assaulted her, and left her for dead. But little did he know, she survived and was able to tell her story. Just because Hall's DNA didn't match the trace amounts of DNA on Anne's ring doesn't mean they were ready to write him off, especially because they'd been direct comparing everyone in the case to that ring. By this point, like 70 people, but nothing had popped up, which made them start to wonder if it really was the killer's DNA at all. When you read the report, it's like they got the killer's DNA on the ring, and what they learned is, no, they have a person's DNA. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the killer. Detectives began to theorize that the blood could have come from a first responder who maybe had been cut while moving Anne's body, or it could have been there before the incident. But none of that meant that Hall was off the hook. There were too many other consistencies, or maybe coincidences. If they were going to rule him out, it needed to be because they could prove he didn't do it. And this is where the tip came in, that they now realized that he had 2 vehicles, one being a white Pontiac, and the other one being a blue vehicle that matched what a witness said was parked behind her car. And now the state police were wondering if there were too many consistencies, could he be responsible? So now he was a target for Anne. So they zeroed in on his vehicles, getting a warrant to search both of Hall's cars, a white Pontiac and a blue pickup truck. At that point, it had been about a month since Anne's murder, but the idea was if detectives could find any evidence that Anne had been in his truck at all, they'd have enough to make a case against Hall. But when they brought Hall's truck to the lab, they found out that while the outside of it was rough and dirty, the inside was immaculately clean, like spotless. Of course, that looked a bit suspicious to detectives, but you can't charge someone for cleaning their car. So they got a warrant to search Hall's home. It's there that they found Heidi's computer and ID, but nothing belonging to Anne, or the Clio girls for that matter. At that point, They didn't feel like there was much else they could do to try and connect Jack Hall to Ann Paetz. Nothing except for waiting for a new tip or lead. About a year later, in June of 2000, Jack Hall was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the assaults of Heidi and the young girls. According to detectives, Ann's case sort of started to stall out after that. They were convinced that Hall was responsible, but there just wasn't enough evidence to charge him. Still, even with no new leads, Michigan State Police refused to give up. Quoted in the Battle Creek Inquirer in 2000, Sergeant Mark Reeves, a state detective from the Flint Post, said that if anybody was looking over their shoulder, they better continue to do that. They don't stop investigating homicide cases. They don't quit. They've been investigated by people before him, by the guys who someday will replace him. And actually, the Michigan State Police have a policy where if a case is inactive, it still has to be reviewed every 6 months by detectives, just to make sure nothing ever slips through the cracks. So somebody's always reading it, looking at it. Did somebody miss something? So throughout the years, it wasn't just put on a shelf. It was continuously reviewed to see if anything could be done with technology changing. Ann's case was reviewed and re-reviewed and re-reviewed again, nearly 50 times over the course of 20 years with no real breakthroughs. But things were about to be taken up a notch, because in 2022, nearly 23 years after Ann's murder, the Saginaw District formed an official cold case team with the sole purpose of doubling down on the district's 93 inactive cases. And they started with Ann's. Arndt and Ribard looked at it and took it on as an approach. They'll just start right from scratch. Interview families, including the victims, do a victimology, do their own. Not just rely on what was in the report, but let's do their own and come up with their own conclusion. So they started again. It was like, nobody's a suspect. Let's develop their own. So they literally took the evidence from this case down to their lab and had their lab and them go through every piece of evidence. So literally hundreds of man-hours to reprocess the evidence of this case. Reprocessing all of the evidence didn't result in any new DNA though. They just had that same profile that was still unidentified some 20 years on. So the detectives decided to go interview Jack Hall in prison 3 times. They said they wanted to try and build some sort of rapport before they asked him about Ann. They went back a 3rd time, and at that point they were going to confront him with the evidence that they had and see what he said. And that lasted 5 minutes, and he threw them out. Well, he tried to throw them out, but it's a prison, so he couldn't really throw them out, but he didn't want to talk to them anymore, so they haven't been back since. That only made detectives more motivated to dig into Hall. They wanted to start from scratch with him. That meant re-interviewing his neighbors, his family, anyone close to him, and things only got more disturbing from there. First, there were Hall's neighbors who said they found what the detectives referred to as a sexual predator kit in the woods by his property. It was essentially a backpack with handcuffs, restraints, lube, and sex toys. And then there was Hall's brother who let detectives know about Hall's side job as a security guard, which came with a pseudo-law enforcement uniform, including a belt, a baton, and handcuffs. So you could look like a policeman pretty easy, and he was doing that as well. There were no official reports of Hall pretending to be a police officer. The case of Ann Paetz remains one of Michigan's most challenging unsolved murders, representing both the limitations of 1999, investigative technology, and the persistent dedication of law enforcement to seek justice for victims and their families. What began as a simple trip for cigarettes in the early morning hours became a brutal crime that has haunted investigators and the Paetz family for more than 2 decades. The investigation into Ann's murder demonstrates the complexity of building a case against a suspect when physical evidence is limited. Despite Jack Hall's conviction for other violent crimes and the circumstantial connections to Ann's case, investigators have been unable to establish the definitive link needed to charge him with her murder. The immaculately clean interior of his truck, discovered weeks after Ann's death, remains one of the most suspicious yet legally insufficient pieces of evidence in the case. Detective Sergeants Arndt and Ribard's renewed investigation in 2022 exemplifies the Michigan State Police's commitment to never abandoning unsolved cases. Their decision to start completely from scratch, reprocessing all evidence and re-interviewing witnesses, reflects the evolution of investigative techniques and the hope that fresh perspectives might reveal previously overlooked connections. The formation of the official cold case team in 2022 with Anne's case as their first priority, signals a new chapter in the search for her killer. While the unidentified DNA profile from her ring has yet to yield a match in Cody's, advances in forensic genetic genealogy and other emerging technologies continue to offer hope for a breakthrough. For Janet Paetz and her surviving children, the investigation represents more than just police work. It's a continuing search for closure and justice that has spanned nearly a quarter century. Anne's brother Jason's memories of that perfect summer day when their world was shattered serve as a poignant reminder of how violent crime forever alters the lives of those left behind. The policy requiring 6-month reviews of inactive cases ensures that Anne's murder will never truly go cold. Each review offers another opportunity for a detective to notice something previously overlooked, for new technology to be applied to old evidence, or for a witness to finally come forward with crucial information. Jack Hall's refusal to cooperate with recent interviews and his documented history of violent crimes against women keep him at the center of investigators' focus. His possession of what detectives described as a sexual predator kit, combined with his security guard uniform that could allow him to impersonate law enforcement, paint a picture of a calculated predator who may have been responsible for more crimes than those for which he was convicted. As the investigation continues into its third decade, the case serves as a testament to the enduring impact of violent crime on communities and families, and to the dedication of law enforcement officers who understand that justice delayed is not justice denied. Whether through DNA analysis, witness testimony, or forensic advances yet to be developed, the search for Ann Paetz's killer continues, driven by the unwavering belief that somewhere, somehow, the evidence exists to finally bring her murderer to. And just a beautiful summer day that Jason Paetz remembered as the worst of his life may someday be remembered differently, as the beginning of a long journey toward justice that finally reached its destination. Until that day comes, Anne's case remains a priority for investigators who refuse to let her memory fade or her killer escape accountability for the brutal crime that took her life in the prime of her youth.